you very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to come and speak to you all. It's my pleasure to be here at the Oriental Institute, really the sort of founding center of Egyptology in the United States. So it's a great pleasure and privilege for me to talk to you about my research. So around 1502 BC, Thutmose I completed the conquest of Kush, incorporated Nubia into an extensive empire that would last through the end of the New Kingdom. And he ordered a number of commemorative inscriptions be placed at Tumbos. And you can see one of them up on the upper right-hand side here, and another one a little bit off in the distance, a little bit harder to see. If I can get these are going right about here, sort of placing his name and the great pride he had in conquering Kush, kind of rubbing Kush's nose in it, really. Or I almost like to think of it as, sort of a dog marking his territory. I mean, insulting at all, but I mean, it's about boundary marking, right? And so this means that Tumbo seems to have been an important symbolic boundary within the Egyptian Empire, even though the actual frontier was hundreds of miles upstream at the fifth cataract of the Nile, at a place called Kirgis, where Thutmose I first left a boundary inscription to be repeated by Thutmose III, and not to be outdone by Ramses II, who had to make everything great. We see this extensive Egyptian empire, but Tumbo seems to be a place of particular interest and particularly important symbolism. Now, just to give you I'll start by giving you a brief overview of the time periods involved, and then a little bit of the broader historical background, and then I'll move on to talk a little bit more specifically about this idea of entanglement and how it plays out at Tumbos. So, as I said, Thutmose I conquered the region in 1502 BC. He plastered all those inscriptions at Tumbos, including a very long, elaborate historical inscription. And then nothing much else seems to have happened until the reigns of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III around 1450 BC, when the colony was inserted at Tumbos, and of course that's what I'll be talking about throughout my presentation today. Now, the New Kingdom Empire lasted from around that period right down to the end of the New Kingdom, under the reign of Ramses XI, when he invited the last viceroy of Kush, Phantes, to intervene in an uprising at Thebes. And Phantes at that point thought, well, I could do this better than Ramses XI, so he decided to attempt to conquer Egypt, was beaten back by a general named Herihor, who later became High Priest of Amun, and retreated back into Nubia, at which point the Egyptians tried to retake Nubia, but in fact were never successful. Eventually, by somewhere around 850 BC, we see the emergence of a new polity in Nubia. And this, Egyptologists have tended to frame this in terms of a total collapse and a reversion to quote-unquote chiefdoms in Nubia, broken up into a series of polities. But a number of lines of evidence, including the evidence from Tumbos itself, suggests that, in fact, there's considerable continuity between the old New Kingdom colony and the emergence of a new Nubian polity. And one of those points of evidence is the inscription of Kadamala from perhaps around 900 BC, or slightly later than that, but clearly before the 25th dynasty, that suggests the emergence of a new royalty based in Nubia, and the emergence of a kind of successor state, or the transition into a new kingdom that eventually, of course, conquered Egypt, starting with Pianki, who was coronated in 747 BC and suppressed a revolt and defeated the Libyan dynasts who had threatened him in the Nile Delta, eventually facing off against the Assyrian army. In the Institute's museum, you can see those wonderful Assyrian reliefs while he was fighting those guys. Eventually he was defeated, but in fact Nubia continued on for a long period of time after this, lasting a kingdom that lasted really around 1,000 years. Now, Tumbos is interesting because it covers this entire period through the 25th dynasty. So from the colony's founding in 1450 BC, we have strong evidence for continuity lasting all the way through the 25th dynasty. And this allows us to ask some interesting questions about the nature of Egyptian colonialism and intercultural interaction, the kind of cultural entanglements that ensued, and the impact of colonization on the rise of the Kushite state. And one of the most interesting ways, I think, to look look at this question, and a key to understanding this phenomenon lies in adopting a focus on an accumulation of individual choices. So a focus on how individuals interacted, adopted, or rejected, or were indifferent to, or otherwise adapted Egyptian practices, but also Nubian practices. So it's kind of a two-way interaction. You can see this in this scene of Nubian princes. So you can see some people in more Nubian dress, some people looking more Egyptian. But even in the folks who look more Egyptian, the sons of the princes right here, you can see they're wearing kind of tassels, depending from their, around their elbows. And this is not an Egyptian feature at all. So you can start looking at these kind of subtle differences, and we can detect this archaeologically. So most of our work is concentrated on the New Kingdom and Acropolis. So you can see here a whole bunch of tombs starting around 1450 BC, but again lasting through about 650 BC through at least the end of the 25th dynasty. A number of monumental pyramid tombs like the tomb of Siamun that I'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute. But before I get on to talking about our results from the cemetery, in this latest phase of excavation from 2015 to 2017, we started looking for the ancient settlement that went with the cemetery. So this big cemetery, and one would expect to find what Egyptologists have called a temple town. So a big fortified settlement, as you would expect in a colony, with some kind of temple in it. But so far it had evaded us. And so the question was where to look for it. Well, there was, so there you see the great inscription to Thutmose II, the village of Tumbos down towards the middle on the right-hand side. And there was a fortress at a place called Ducky Island, but it clearly was Christian in date, and in any case it faces the wrong direction. So if the Egyptians are going to be worried about anything, a place to place a fortification, they're going to be worried about people coming up from the south. Some of those Kermans who maybe weren't so happy about the fact that the Egyptians conquered them. So that made no sense. And a series of inscriptions by a group of viceroys placed at Tumbos, again reinforcing the idea that the Third Cataract was a kind of symbolic boundary, all pointed towards the area right around the modern village of Tumbos. And in fact, this is also close to the cemetery. And as we started walking, even just like literally in the house that we were staying in, we would walk around and we would look at the ground, as archaeologists do. Right? We tend to stare at the ground a lot. And we kept seeing all this pottery. And there was clearly New Kingdom pottery, so there had to be something there. And we started off with a couple of test excavations, didn't find much, found some pottery. But then we started excavating on a large scale underneath the modern town. And I have to give a real shout out to the people of Tumbos who put up with our digging holes in their streets and everything. A little grumpy at times, understandably, but for the most part, very cooperative and very, very happy to have us poking around in their village, which was really nice of them. And I have to give another shout out to Mohammed Farouk Abdul Rahman Ali, who was a graduate student at UCSB, obviously native Sudanese, and is now Dr. Mohammed, which is a great source of pride for me. But he's an amazing guy, really cool guy, and he made all the negotiations with the local people, including in this excavation area, actually convincing someone to let us dismantle their house, which was just at foundations at that point, so it wasn't tearing down his whole house, but he'd started building a house, and all the walls were up about this big. And with compensation, naturally, we tore down his preliminary house and dug a big hole under it. And this was very key to understanding what was going on underneath the village. But just to backtrack a little bit, we started in 2013 again with Mohammed Farouk playing a key role, and Bruce Wayans as well, who's sitting right here. Who's made a huge contribution to Nubian archaeology, and has come out with me every year we've worked at Tumbos. We excavated in the area around our house. Actually, our house is right there. So that's our dig house. And so we decided, well, we saw all this pottery around, so we'd try a few test units. And in the one sort of right next to the road, next to a canal, we actually found the remains of a building, which was very exciting. And with lots of pottery and other artifacts along with it. So we thought, aha, here we have the town. So we started excavating all around the town, and we found a whole lot of nothing until we got up to the northern part where you see the image up there, where we found a strange underground structure. So a large, you can see here, it's about 15 meters long by 3 meters wide, at least as we had it exposed there. And it was a trench that had been dug about 2 meters deep, lined with mud brick, plastered with a plaster floor, with a little bit of settlement debris, some pottery, a little bit of animal bone, a few other assorted objects that suggested a domestic kind of occupation of some sort, but not a lot, mostly filled in with sand, little flaps, and so on. And this was a real question. What is this underground thing? I mean, I couldn't find any good parallels for it elsewhere. Maybe an underground storeroom? I mean, it's hot in Sudan, so it makes sense to have someplace underground where you might store things. So then the next field season, we decided to trace it out, and it kept going. Like the Energizer Bunny, it kept, just went along, and we found a corner, and then we thought, aha, okay, this is some kind of enclosure. And the pottery suggested a date right around this time frame that we know the site was established. Probably starting to infill with trash about the reign of Amenhotep III. You see distinctive vessels like this one, this kind of carinated or angled bowls. You can see some examples in here of decoration. Some of them, that one shirred with the dots and lines, might be a little bit earlier in the sequence, some of them a little bit later, but bracketing about that time range between the founding of the colony around the reign of Thutmose III to around the reign of Amenhotep III, let's say not later than about 1300 BC. And at that point, the town wasn't abandoned, because we found later pottery there, and the cemetery continues right through, but apparently the fortifications were abandoned. And as one archaeologist has said, because of an idea called the schlep factor. So basically, you don't want to schlep your trash any farther than you have to. You have this big trench that's empty, and okay, trash goes in there. You don't want to drag it across into a dump someplace. So you use the most expedient place, and you fill it full of trash. And trust me, we found thousands of potsherds. It became a kind of a logistical nightmare to deal with them all, but we found some nice ones like this. The site has also produced some other diagnostic pottery from this time frame. The cemetery was very active during this period, including, and these are from the cemetery, not the settlement, but examples of blue-painted ware, which is a very distinctive kind of pottery, and I'm happy to say archaeologists love this kind of thing. This is the farthest south that blue-painted ware has ever been found. Somebody may find it, somewhere south later on. That's fine. But for now, I've got bragging rights. But this shows that this site was actually tapped into kind of the larger political network, because this is very closely associated with the palace industry and elite distribution. So clearly, the people at Tumbos were important. They were very much part of the larger political economy of trade, exchange, and of the empire. So this was an important place, as suggested already by the boundary inscriptions. We also found a lot of domestic pottery of various kinds. Most interestingly, from the point of view of entanglement, Nubian pottery. So here you see, handmade pottery, mat impress. This one has applied clay to the bottom of it, which is typical of cook pots in this period of time to help avoid thermal shock, so it absorbs some of the heat that was coming in so the pot wouldn't crack. And you can see this one very sooty here, clearly used for making pots. This one quite sooty as well. And here's an Egyptian-style cooking pot. And the interesting thing about this is that most of the cooking pottery seems to be Nubian. And it wasn't because they didn't have Egyptian cook pots. As you can see, that pot on the upper left-hand side, in fact, is quite sooted, and it's a typical shape for an ancient Egyptian cook pot. So it suggests that there's some kind of impact on Egyptian cuisine and cooking. And this could very well come through the intermarriage of women into the colony. This is a very common trend that we see in ancient colonial situations and more modern ones as well. Gil Stein, based here at the Oriental Institute, has talked a little bit about this in his work. But also in the more recent history of colonialism, we see over and over again that when colonies are inserted, they tend to be a bit man-heavy, and people want to establish relationships. It also allows people to establish ties with the local community and create a kind of more informal back channel for resolving any disputes that might occur. So it makes a lot of sense that if you're talking to your father-in-law, as opposed to, you know, the leader of the guy over in the next town or village. You know, it's a much more smooth way of dealing with channels and so on. So again, showing the kind of international ties that the site had. We've also found Mycenaean pottery, and again, I can say that this is the farthest south that Mycenaean pottery has ever been found, which is really quite amazing when you think about it. I mean, it's like 1,000 miles up the Nile from Mycenae, and we're getting these typically smaller vessels, flasks like this one. That one, there's not a scale, but in reality, the pot is about this big. And so it would have been used to hold something like perfumes or some kind of flavored oils, perhaps, some kind of valuable commodity. And we are finding sherds of it in the settlement. So in addition to being in the cemetery as a kind of prestige good associated with the burial, we're also getting it in terms of daily use within the cemetery itself. Now, we do have evidence from the pottery in the cemetery. A lot of this one would date to about 1300 BC. But we do have pottery that's later, including this duck censer from the cemetery, and then a sherd of just the duck part, the duck's head part, from the settlement. And this has to be the cutest pot I've ever found in this list. But it was used for burning incense, and the duck itself was found at the entrance underground at the bottom of a shaft next to the entrance to a burial chamber. And I love this kind of thing because I can imagine, you know, the deceased relatives going through the ceremony of placing the dead underground and burning incense, the scent of the gods coming along. So really cool, yeah.
The lights. Can you turn down the lights?
Sure. There we go. Much better. Okay. Thank you. So there you go. So you can see our Ducky little sensor right there. It's so cute, I have to say. Anyway. So this would date to the Ramesside period, so somewhere around 1290 to 1000 BC, and maybe even into the what Egyptologists call the Third Intermediate Period, so the period after the end of the New Kingdom, but more likely towards the end of the New Kingdom at some point. And then here on the left-hand side, a couple of red polished vessels on the top, part of a sharply carinated bowl, so again with the sharp angles. And then a kind of kettle-necked jar that should be somewhere in the Ramesside period. And then on the right-hand side, that white piece is very diagnostic for the Third Intermediate period. So, and we have other sherds that would indicate this long history of settlement at the site. We just haven't really found any major deposits like we have for the New Kingdom. But that may just be the fact that this fortification was abandoned in the New Kingdom and then filled in with debris and trash and eventually sand and so on. And that's why we had the large deposits, and that we just haven't found the area where they were throwing their trash away in the Third Intermediate period. I can only hope to find lots of good Third Intermediate period trash. But this also included a lot of normal domestic things, a spindle whorl fragment in the upper left, and rather enigmatic little ground sherd disc that, for lack of a better explanation, could be a gaming piece, which actually is pretty plausible. That's kind of an archaeological cop-out, though. It's either a ritual object or gaming piece, you know. But it would make sense as a gaming piece. And then groundstone for processing grain and so on. Also, different kinds of lithic material for cutting metal, alabaster fragments of vessels and things like this. All the detritus of life during this period of time. And one of my favorite things, they look like clay beads, but in fact they're net weights. And therefore exactly this kind of net that the guy on the lower left at Tumbos is fishing with. And in fact, he's one of the guys who's worked for us and supplies us with fish while we're digging there, which is very tasty. But it's a kind of net where you throw it in and it spreads out wide. It sinks down to the bottom. And then when you pull it up, it kind of goes like this and traps the fish inside. A very distinctive kind of fishing, and very cool to see it documented through these kinds of objects, which are really common at these archaeological sites. So we kept following this ditch out, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger. And so in the end, it was 215 meters east-west, going to the edge of the Nile where clearly it had eroded, so it's 215 meters plus. And then we got to 230 meters north-south, and as one does in an archaeological dig, ran out of time. You're just like pulling your hair out. You're going, oh, just a little bit more. But at some point you've got to shut it down, and so we decided that was it. So now we have a major thing to follow up on. Now, in the northern part of that, the area is totally destroyed. The town is totally destroyed, ancient town, by the modern village. But underneath this palm grove, there's a real possibility that we may, in fact, have the remains of the ancient settlement, which would be very exciting. But at this point, we just have a little bit of an idea about what was going on in the settlement and a little bit of idea of the sort of cultural entanglements that might have existed, particularly a kind of gendered perspective on that through the influence of Nubian women, perhaps on the colonial cuisine. But we hope to be able to explore that further in future excavation seasons. Now, we did find evidence of the collapse of an inner wall in one area and perhaps a gateway in the upper left there. And that would lead, if you took a path right from this area here, where there appeared to be a gateway, basically a point where the trench was filled in with hard-packed mud and lined with stone, which would make a lot of sense. And if you go up this way, you find that giant stela of Thutmose III and the inscriptions of several of the viceroys. So again, a very important symbolic point. It's kind of aligned already to the northern exit out of the city. So or the colony, very interesting idea. And then some other areas of reuse and infill, including one area that had a whole bunch of bread molds in it for baking kind of bread sticky things that were prized in offerings, that may hint at the presence of a temple nearby, because if we have a fortification, we ought to have a temple somewhere. So again, that's something we'll be looking at. Now this trench, kind of a dry moat fortification, has a parallel at the site of Sesabe, but it's only about 80 meters to a side. And in fact, if we compare Tumbos to other sites, we find that Tumbos is very, very large indeed. So it outstrips most of the other New Kingdom colonies, both going back to the Middle Kingdom fortresses in Lower Nubia, but also the New Kingdom establishments like Sai Island. Almost double the size of Sai Island, probably by the end when we are able to map the fullest extent, about twice as much. Several times the contemporary enclosure at Sesabe, but later on there was a mud brick structure built. And the dates track almost exactly with the construction of this moat at Sesabe and the increased investment in fortifications at Sai, and a real stronger investment in settler colonialism. So actually Egyptians coming and settling in these sites. And we do actually have evidence from the cemetery, from work led by my colleague Michelle Bouzon from Purdue University, who directs the bioarchaeological component of it. Using strontium isotope analysis, we can tell that initially something like 40% of the earliest burials are individuals who probably came from Egypt, interestingly, both men and women. And then, immigration from Egypt continues throughout the New Kingdom down to the Ramesside period, and then cuts off abruptly with the Third Intermediate period, which makes a lot of sense from the historical reconstruction. But it's interesting that we see this flow of colonists coming in throughout this period. But also clearly intermarrying with local people, because the population itself looks to be of a kind of mixed biological ancestry. And I can go into that in more detail if you're interested, but I'd like to move on to other things. One last point to make about the settlement is that it matches up to a place mentioned by the Viceroy Mary Mosa in an inscription at another site at a place called Semna, but who left in a stela that you can see here, a very nice one, at Tumbos. But he talks about raising troops between Baki, which we know is the fortress of Kuban in Lower Nubia, and a place called Taroy, which has to be Tumbos. So there are no other likely sites. It's about the right distance, about 590 kilometers, that's mentioned in the text. And it makes a lot of sense with this idea of a symbolic boundary at the Third Cataract. So we can see a kind of distinction between a zone of incorporation into an empire with colonies established and settler colonialism, and then a zone where there was a more indirect or hands-off policy of a kind of indirect looking at leaving a certain degree of autonomy to the local princes and a less cultural impact. So we have heavy cultural impact in the north from Egypt with these cultural entanglements, and then a little bit more diversity in the south and local control. And Tumbos, that makes Tumbos a kind of important
boundary, a location between the two cultures, and perhaps helping to negotiate the sort of cultural differences between them. Now, initially, the cemetery at Tumbos looks very Egyptian, with monumental tombs, like the tomb of Siamun, who we know held the title of scribe reckoner of the gold of Kush. And this may hint at why Tumbos is such a large enclosure. The scribe reckoners of gold had a lot to do with the assembly of tribute, or tribute is really not a particularly accurate term. In ancient Egypt, it was called inu. And this was something like a ceremonial gift to the king. Now, there were certain expectations about how much you should be giving to the king. And in exchange, of course, the king gave you the breath of life. A pretty good deal for the king, I would say. But, just saying. But it's about establishing a relationship of patronage. The king would protect you in exchange for these kind of personal gifts. But in reality, it was a source of income for the state, and in particular, the palace. And so very important. So Siamun's tomb is the largest one. It also was tricked out. So this had funerary cones, which are normally a Theban thing. There's over 400 tombs in Thebes that were decorated with cones. There are something on the order of a dozen outside of Thebes that were decorated with cones. There's only one other site that has cones in Nubia, one tomb at a place called Aniba, which was the colonial capital in Lower Nubia. And Tumbos, we have now at least 2 tombs with friezes of cones, perhaps 3. So really interesting, again, very close connection with Thebes, the sort of main southern center of Egypt, the home of the cult of Amun-Re, and an important political establishment, and where the main point of control for the Nubian colony throughout most of Egyptian history. Now, these tombs were elaborately decorated, and we were very lucky. This doesn't look very exciting, I know, but for me it was exceptionally exciting because these tombs were made out of mud brick, and so decoration almost never survives. And we were lucky enough to find a brick that was reused in a later tomb, excuse me, that still had traces of a scene on it, of priests carrying something. You can see the shaved heads, and you have to trust me a little bit. But if you look at the arc of the back of the head in front there in particular, and then you look at the eyebrow, and if you look closely, you can see lips, and it's really good stuff. I mean, this isn't like some provincial artist who's just, sort of hacking it out. This is somebody who really knows what they're doing. And so this suggests that there was a whole community of artisans who were supplying the needs of these elite colonists, the bureaucrats who were running the colony. Some of these bureaucrats may in fact have been originally Nubian in ancestry, but they had in effect assimilated to Egyptian cultural norms. But some of them, and I suggest Siamun probably is one of them, may have been colonists, in his case, probably coming from Thebes. They were also buried in Egyptian-style coffins. This one was a bit weird, though, because there were 3 people in this coffin, 2 women and 1 guy, and I'll leave your imaginations to figure out what the relationship might have been. It could have been his sister and his mother, or could have been something else, I don't know. I always say that when we got down to the guy, the bioarchaeologist I work with said, "Ooh, he's a hunk." So anyway, you can actually tell that because the bones get bigger as you pump up and you get muscular. So you can tell if the dude's ripped, and dude was ripped. So that's all I'm saying. Again, I'm not saying could be just female relatives of some kind. Doesn't have to be anything else. But I don't know. But I was very excited about this coffin. As you can see, it's been badly eaten by termites, which is a real problem at Tumbos. We rarely get very well preserved wood. But this one, at least the decoration was preserved. I don't know how well you can see it. It's a little dark, but there's a little figure of one of the 4 sons of Horus who protected the innards of the person, and there's an inscription on there. And as Egyptologists will do, I got very excited and started reading it off in ancient Egyptian. Imachi Kher Duamutef, blessed before Duamutef, one of the 4 sons of Horus. Fortunately, Michelle, though, rushed up to me and said, "Stuart, no, stop," because you know what happens when you start reading inscriptions in front of, mummies get up and the dead walk again and they start chasing your team, and trust me, it's a bummer. You don't want to go there. So thankfully, she saved us from disaster. And you'd think I would know, having, as you mentioned, it consulted on the mummy movies. You'd think I know better than to do that, but no. It just shows you that conceit in those films. Absolutely true. People say, don't read from the book, and I'm going to read from the book. I'm not going to listen to that. Now, normally coffin, look, and the shared coffin thing may be an aspect of the fact that of relatives of one kind or another, whatever their exact relationship was, sharing in the magical spells that appear on the coffin. And one of the things about coffins is you can look on them as a kind of resurrection machine, in a way. It helps the deceased, successfully become rejuvenated in the afterlife and become an immortal god, immortal Ba that exists on forever and continues to protect the deceased after death. And so this may be relatives trying to get in on that. The top area was also a little disturbed, and the coffin lid was a little ajar. So it maybe suggests that a little bit of the underworld of ancient tumbos, of people robbing tombs but trying to cover it up. So they rifled the top body and then just sort of put the lid back over it. But it was just a little off, so you could see that someone had been messing around with it. Now, we were very lucky this past field season in 2017 to find pieces of wood coffins, which was super exciting for me because we never find pieces of wood like this. I don't know why the termites decided not to eat these. This is a really very fine quality. There were fragments of 2 coffins that, of course, tomb robbers had completely torn apart. Don't ask me why, because tomb robbers are not nice people, I guess. And it includes these beautifully carved scenes, and we have now a Hemnecher priest, which is a fairly high-level priestly title, and his wife, Becky. So a guy named Horemheb and his wife, Becky. I love that name. But the inscriptions are also kind of weird. I haven't had a time to really parse this out. But they're somewhat unusual for a coffin. They're conventional in some ways, but the layout is weird. And one of the coffins at least mentions both him and his wife. And there were clearly 2 coffins, one for him, one for his wife. So it's very curious, but it may also suggest, again, a kind of local coffin industry by someone who was really skilled, because the hieroglyphs are very well carved, the inscriptions are very legible, except the layout being slightly weird, and the renderings of the different deities are very nicely done. It's really a very high-quality coffin with ebony inlaid eyes. You can see one of them there. So something very fine is going on with this coffin, but it does seem to be kind of a local thing. So we're also getting an aspect of a kind of local reinterpretation maybe of some Egyptian ideas and rituals. And this tomb was also equipped with funerary cones mentioning a Hemnecher priest, but in the way of cones, really hard to read. So this says Hemnecher, and of course where the name is, it's hard to read. So it could be Horemheb, could be some other Hemnecher, I don't know. And then some mention of Amun, maybe a reference to the temple, but then a Emniut, I don't know. Anyway, it's a very odd inscription. But very exciting to find another tomb with its own set of funerary cones. Again, a very Theban connection. And then we also have evidence, remarkably, of a copy of the Book of the Dead, although rather freakishly preserved. So this is actually a fragment of somebody's skull. I'll give you an enhanced version of it. You can see hieroglyphs. But you can also see they're running at sort of cross purposes. So either they were really freaky and decorating skulls with spells, hieroglyphic spells. But I think what's happened is a copy of the Book of the Dead or a similar papyrus. I haven't actually confirmed that it's a Book of the Dead, but it would make sense. Kind of got crumpled up, stuck up against the skull, and through some strange taphonomic process, the ink transferred to the skull, maybe as part of decay or something like that. And then the papyrus decayed completely, and we ended up with the skull fragment. But we found several fragments of skull like this. But exciting because it shows that they had funerary papyri, which is something that is hard to find in Nubia because of the poor preservation of organic materials generally. They also had heart scarabs. This one I love with the little human-headed scarab. It's a rare variant. Normally it's just a scarab, but a number of these have been found in Egypt and Nubia, dedicated to a woman, mistress of the house, or a lady named Ware. And then this beautiful Ushabti, not a whole lot of Ushabtis from Tumbos, but this one quite nice. But kind of curious, the Ushabti itself is beautifully carved. You can see the sensitive treatment of the face, inlaid eyes, and so on. But if you look at the inscription, it's actually quite crude. So it's like they bought an Ushabti blank, maybe imported from Egypt or from some workshop, and then, like Uncle Jehudi was the one who did the inscription and just went, oh yeah, I know how to do this, and went shh, and so it's literate. So although it's a bit hieratic-y, so I haven't really come up with a satisfactory translation, but it's laid out like a coffin would be, which is a legitimate variant of how Ushabtis are. Normally they have the spell that in case the gods should call upon you to do any work like this from the tomb of Senedjem, the Shoppi will jump up and say, here I am, and run around and do the work for you. If I was an ancient Egyptian, I definitely want one of these. That's all I'm saying. We also found canopic jars, this one to a lector priest, so again hinting at perhaps the presence of a temple at Tumbos, with still the sad remnants of the person's internal organs in them. So they indicating the full-on mummification treatment. Even though we think of evisceration as a standard part of Egyptian mummification, in fact, it's rather unusual. It's really restricted to the upper echelons of Egyptian society. And other objects, bits of cosmetic vessels, lots of jewelry and so on, especially as we go down the social ladder. And then here's another tomb. We actually found several now ceramic coffins, maybe a solution to termites, maybe a cheaper version of wood. But very interesting. Again, certainly a local industry because you don't want to transport these over very long distances because they're big, clunky, and rather fragile. And then the lowest, sort of most simple kind of burial on the upper left, an individual who was wrapped up in a reed bundle. And this is something that at new excavations at the city of Amarna, they found a lot of burials like this. And this is apparently how poorer people were buried in Egypt. If you couldn't afford a coffin, you at least got wrapped up in a reed mat. And then here a nice scarab from Queen Hatshepsut, our earliest royal name. So again, reinforcing that idea of Thutmose III. Let me go back and point out one thing. And there we go. And in the middle of the shaft, one burial here that's flexed in Nubian style. And this is another interesting pattern that we've seen. Here's another tomb with a flexed burial in it, dating from around the reign of Thutmose III, based on the pottery, or perhaps slightly afterwards. And in another tomb, in this case, probably dating from around the reign of Amenhotep III, a woman buried in flexed position. This is kind of in the fetal position, so very much in a Nubian style. All women so far. We found about 10 burials of women in this flexed position at Tumbos. Now that's a minority, but nevertheless, it would have made an important statement about identity. And you've got to be kind of impressed by this. These Nubian women who had entered into society insisting on being buried this way, and of course their families ultimately were the ones who decided to do it. But during a funeral, it would have been very obvious. Compared to an Egyptian funeral with a mummified burial in a coffin and so on, we have a woman probably carried out on a bed to the necropolis, wrapped in some kind of shroud perhaps, but a very different set of ritual practices that would have really highlighted her Nubian identity. And there have been a number of other burials found. Here's an example from Soleb. But my favorite one is this one, which, it's kind of a relaxed burial, shall we say. But in fact, she was originally like this. And what's happened is someone has pushed her arm up while the body was still fresh. Because once a body starts to desiccate and dry out, it gets brittle. But the body was still flexible. So it was sometimes after rigor mortis had released, but before the body had had a chance to desiccate, because everything's articulated. And what they were doing was they were going after a necklace around her neck, and probably a piece of valuable jewelry, very likely gold. And the reason I know she had a necklace is that these amulets were behind her neck. So here she's buried very deliberately in a Nubian style, very much contrasting with the other burials in the tomb. There was that one other Nubian burial of a woman from about the same time period, and then, but otherwise all the other burials in this tomb were Egyptian in style. And yet she still had these amulets of Bes around her neck. And Bes, I mean, what's not to like about Bes? He's a little ugly, but that's a good thing. He's ugly cute, And he scares away evil demons and snakes and other things that come in the night to get you. So a very protective god, a household god, particularly connected with women. And the little Bes, the dancing Bes with the tambourine, was actually so beloved by this woman that in spite of the fact that the head broke, it was actually strung through the arms. So the head broke off in antiquity and was lost at some point. But she loved this amulet so much that she kept it on the string. So I love these moments where you get a real sort of window on someone's life. So we also have found Nubian pottery. Now, again, according to conventional ideas about Egyptianization of Nubia, Nubian ceramics, Nubian cultural practices should have ended by this period of time. And yet we see a persistence of these traditions, muted, admittedly, but still continuing on right through the New Kingdom. And you see a nice cookpot on the left-hand side. The cookpot was found in the courtyard of Siamun's tomb. So again, reflecting these kinds of entanglements. Yeah, maybe Siamun's tomb is very Egyptian and even Theban in orientation, but the rituals, when they were doing the ritual meal, probably funerary feasts or preparing food for an offering, commemoration, they were doing it in a Nubian cooking pot and perhaps with Nubian-style cooking. And then this nice cup that was actually found associated with a couple of other burials of Nubian women in flexed position again. Now, one of the further entanglements increased during the Ramesside period at Tumbos. And so here you see the core part of the original cemetery. Right next to it, starting around 1200, or maybe even a little bit earlier than that, a separate cemetery with tumuli. So tumuli are just a kind of round mound, in our case made out of the local granite stones in a kind of ad hoc manner. In these tumuli, we've done a series of radiocarbon dates, and the ones with stars are from the cemetery, but you can see we have a nice continuous sequence from the New Kingdom, the Ramesside period, so from about 1200, 1300 BC, running all the way through the Third Intermediate period, all the way down to the 25th dynasty. There's a little gap in the radiocarbon dates between the very end of the Third Intermediate period and the beginning of the 25th dynasty, right around 800 BC. But in fact, we have pots like this one that should indicate solidly 25th dynasty burials still occurring within the cemetery. So what we have are kind of a multi-vocality or multicultural context, where some people are signaling a more Egyptian association with more Egyptian past and identity with these continuing construction of pyramid tombs and other mud brick tomb structures, the reuse of older tombs, and at the same time you have people being buried under Nubian-style funerary monuments, signaling very much their Nubian identity. But when you start looking at the burials themselves, we see that they're heavily entangled. And so in the case of the tumuli, we have a shaft leading down to a side chamber. In this case, we've opened out the shaft a little bit, but you can imagine for safety reasons, but the shaft would have been right about in through here, leading down to a side chamber. That's a very Egyptian form of substructure. It's oriented roughly east-west, with the body head to the west, facing east towards the rising sun, very much in line with Egyptian theology. And yet you have those trenches, which were for bed legs to sit down in, and we have actually remnants of beds, again, eaten by termites, but a rather nicely preserved one up on the upper left. And that actually dates to the New Kingdom. So a radiocarbon date 1216 to 1048 BC from the Ramesside period, along with this blacktop, rather unusual blacktop pot, again indicating a continuity of Nubian cultural traditions. But at the same time, we have all these amulets of Egyptian style. The smaller ones up above are from the perhaps late New Kingdom into the early Third Intermediate period. The larger ones, those two lovely ones of Isis, and there's a little one of the dwarf god Patekos that I'll have a close-up in just 1 second. And this very unusual scarab. It's rather large for scarabs. It's about this big. Scarabs are normally like this, with a very unusual scene on it of offering bearers, one carrying a pot and one carrying something else, maybe a pot, maybe a bag, with little lotuses on either side. And this is something that has no parallel in Egypt that I've been able to find. It seems sort of in an Egyptian tradition, but I think what it is Nubians kind of riffing off of ancient Egyptian iconography. So yeah, it's a scarab, but it's different. It's bigger than a normal scarab should be. It's got, offering bearers. That's a sort of scene that you expect from Egypt, but not on a scarab. So they're starting to be adaptive. They're starting to be selective. They're picking things and they're generating new Egyptian-themed objects, but with their own particular ideas in mind. And this is very much part of that notion of entanglement. So we see not just simply the imitation of Egyptian things, although in some cases, like the burials I showed you earlier, again, some of those people probably were originally of Nubian ancestry, but eventually assimilated into Egyptian norms. But increasingly what we see are these kind of entangled representations and new things. This Patekos, really quite remarkable. I mean, this is something you might expect to find in a royal tomb. It's really a beautiful example of the artisan of Fayence's work. And in a way, it fits into the normal Patekos figures, but it's also a little unusual. It has these sort of magical figures on the base of it. the figure of the goddess on the back, very popular in Nubia regardless. So the Nubians were also selective about the deities they chose to worship. They were big on Isis, a strong queenly figure, and we know that Nubian queens were in fact much more prominent than Egyptian queens were. Gods like Bes, the little dwarf god, perhaps through the intervention of women like the woman buried at Tumbos, who just decided, this is a cool god, and yeah, I want to worship him, because he's going to protect me when I'm sleeping, and protect me in childbirth and everything else. And that eventually entered into the Nubian lexicon as well as the Egyptian ones. And whatever the case, there was certainly a preference for potatoes. Perhaps this is even a local product, again, kind of adapting a little bit from Egyptian ideas. Another example of this is in one tomb that was reused. So this tomb was originally built in the New Kingdom, and this is where that little Ducky incense burner came from, right down at the bottom of the shaft in front of the entrance to the main chamber of the tomb. But about halfway down the shaft, we found the extraordinary burial of a horse, which for me was very cool, because I actually have a horse and I ride. So finding a horse was totally unexpected and really, really cool. It even still had fur on its hindquarters, so I can tell you that the horse was chestnut with white socks. And when we recently had an article published about this, and it got a lot of traction in the news. I was pleased to see that not only did it make it to the archaeological blogs and things, but also the horsey ones. So that was just a lot of fun. But it's a practice that we see at El Kuru, the cemetery of the 25th dynasty kings, where they buried whole chariot teams. And it's a practice we see at a number of different places in Nubia. This one is particularly interesting because of the date, so just after the end of the New Kingdom. So it shows that they're also kind of developing new and powerful symbols. In this case, the horse, which actually our horse specialist said was harnessed to something, almost certainly a chariot, was a formidable military machine on the one hand, representing the power and might of Nubian civilization, and the individual who owned the horse and perhaps was a charioteer. It also, symbolically was very important to the Nubian kings. In fact, when Pianki finally defeated his enemies and recaptured a city that had rebelled against him, he seemed to have been more offended at the fact that they had mistreated his horses than at the fact that they rebelled. So he goes into the stables and he totally chews them out for well, look at my horse, what are you doing? So the Nubians were very much into horses, and this kind of gives you a little bit of a preview on a more private level. It even had a little scarab associated with it, and at Kuru they had these more elaborate designs. It also had some iron tack, which is really interesting because this is very early for iron in North Africa. But in line with what new excavations at Merowe, previously it was thought that the iron industry didn't start there until about 500 BC, but now it's known that it stretches back at least to the 25th dynasty by, let's say, 750 BC. And in fact, I think the latest evidence is pushing it back even into the time period that we're at. So I'd like to talk about one other tomb where we got some of our most remarkable finds, and it illustrates this process of entanglement. And you see here a pyramid tomb built in the 25th dynasty. And right next to it, the one I'm going to talk about, is this little tomb here. You can just barely see it. Would have been a little domed chamber tomb, a little vaulting over it. To someone, not the most important person in the cemetery. That would have been the guy buried in here. And we did excavate this tomb, and we found an interesting sort of seemingly random orientation of burials. So they seem to have broken out of that east-west orientation, and were kind of moving people around as they liked. Although there was some tomb robbery, so it could be that disturbance, but I suspect, in fact, that it does represent a little bit of entanglement, or at least an adjustment of Nubian norms. But there was at least one heart scarab, this one, which could date from the New Kingdom, since this area was used during the New Kingdom, but the style of it looks almost identical to the royal heart scarabs from the 25th dynasty. So this reflects the fact that Tombos, in spite of the end of the New Kingdom, was still an important critical center with a really wealthy elite in this part of Nubia, even after the colony ended. And that means that the impact of Egyptian colonialism was a lasting one. It didn't just end with the end of the New Kingdom, but continued on afterwards through these processes of entanglement. So anyway, back to our tomb here. So you can see there it is. The vaulting had apparently collapsed when tomb robbers broke into it and rather rudely broke the mummy in half. I think going after, again, probably gold jewelry around the neck. And then at that point, I think what happened was they had undermined the vaulting and it fell in. And they got in their gold jewelry and they just went, meh, and left. And I love lazy tomb robbers. They're really awesome because they take the stuff that would be a real pain to deal with, gold. Trust me, I do not want to find gold because everybody gets excited over gold, too excited. So then they start going in and they start digging holes in your site, and the government gets involved and they weigh it and everything. No, it's a mess. So I'm just as happy that the tomb robbers get the gold and then I get the rest of the stuff. And this was just full of things. And it reflects this kind of entanglement. So superficially, the tomb looks very Egyptian, kind of mud brick structure, underground structure. And here you see the burial. And you'll have to trust me because all the wood's decayed. But it was heavily wrapped, and I could separate the wrappings from the wood. We actually found some scraps of linen as well. And so a heavily wrapped mummy within a mummiform coffin, but on a bed. So the bed burial is a very strong Nubian tradition. So we already have this kind of entangled set of burials. And you can see from this nice scarab of a griffin trampling an Asiatic. I like to think of him as an Assyrian, but whatever. With the name of Shabako, one of the key Nubian kings. So this dates the tomb to about 700 BC and consistent with the radiocarbon date. Also, black-topped pottery, again, continuing on. This one's really interesting, though, because it was thrown on a wheel. So as I mentioned, Nubian pottery is handmade, and the handmade traditions continued into this period. But in this case, this is kind of a hybrid. So you have an Egyptian technology, a new shape, this kind of drop vase, but an old decorative motif, very reminiscent of the great Kerma civilization from the Bronze Age. So they're looking back and pulling in decorative motifs, but adapting it to the latest technology. Very cool. And amulets around his neck, a bunch of Egyptian ones, as one might expect. But this group of, actually these weren't around his neck, I correct myself. They were in a little pile next to him. They could have come from the body, but sometimes maybe a little basket or something that had since decayed full of jewelry. And then a set of beads. The ones below are kind of dark, but they're made out of hematite. And then the ones above are made out of quartz, a very important symbolic material for Nubians. And the juxtaposition of black and white is a kind of color choice that we also see in the great cemetery at Kerma on tombs with white and black stone. So it seems to be have a very Nubian sensibility. Two, we have the dwarf god Patekos, again very popular in Nubia, Amun-Re, a goose, a reference to Amun again. The Nubians were also into frogs, the god/goddess Hecate. Eye of Horus, always popular. But my favorite amulet is a little kitty amulet that was also found there that has a little Nefer sign underneath it, so beautiful cat. I'm a cat person too, so yeah, I like that a lot. A really remarkable scarab, also reflecting his connection to the sort of wider world. So in a way, he's signaling his Nubian identity through the bed burial, but then his Egyptian connections through the mummified burial, but then this cosmopolitan thing with this object. So this is unique. I don't know of anyone like it, if any of you out there has seen anything like it. But it's a copper scarab. I don't have a scale on it, but it's about this big. So it's about 3 inches long, so a bit large. It has a variant on a cryptographic inscription that means something like, Amun loves the one who loves him. And you can't just read that. You have to use cryptography, but it works pretty well. The normal inscription is much shorter. And so this is a very sophisticated little work of art, as well as a religious item. So something interesting is going on with this guy. He also had the latest iron weaponry. This is very early, again, for iron in Nubia. But then right next to it, a stack of arrows tipped with microliths. So you have the latest technology on the one hand, and a technology in Nubia, particularly with these multiple microlith composite arrowheads, that goes back to the Neolithic period. So again, he's signaling cosmopolitan, latest technology, tradition as well. So it's a complex, multifaceted kind of guy. And it's great when you can kind of get a handle on that. You had copper alloy bowls, and it's a little hard to see, but with the white outlining there are a series of bowls running around them. These could even be Phoenician imports, but certainly in the international style of the time. And in fact, in the tomb of one of Bianchi's wives, this faience bowl from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has exactly the same motif of the bowls. This is surely a local product, so they may be imitating these items in the international style. But by far and away, the most extraordinary thing that I found is this wooden box. And people always ask you, what's the coolest thing you've ever found as an archaeologist? And before we found this, I had to say, well, it's this or that. I mean, the woman with the scarabs and with the best amulets is pretty cool, and some other stuff. But this thing is really remarkable. So you have to look at it carefully, but this is an open work design of papyrus columns. I think you can see open, close bud, open, close bud, open, close bud, with empty space in between where there's dirt. And then in the middle of it, there's a cow, I'll help you out here, licking a calf. And then in front of the cow licking a calf is a stork, probably a reference to the Bennu bird. So this is all about creation, fertility. The cow is a reference to the goddess Hathor. The stork is quite unique and very interesting. And again, it seems to be riffing off of Egyptian themes, but combining them in new ways. But the cow and the calf actually is this motif. So this is from the Assyrian capital at Nimrud, but it's exactly the same thing that we find on this amazing decorated wooden box. And I think that you may even have a few examples of fragments from these in the Oriental Institute collection from excavations in Iraq from the Assyrians. So this is very much part of the international style. Again, this guy is plugged in terms of the whole, he's very hip. I mean, he's up with the latest stuff. But he also is that, like, I'm a dude too, man. I'm one of you guys as well. So inside we're getting hints at, you can see a couple little vessels peeking out. Another unique motif of clumps of papyrus and a person carrying water on a yoke with maybe a calf in front of them. Could be a goat, I don't know, or a sheep rather. But this scene too with an image of the sun god as creator, as Nefertum, an infant king emerging from a lotus blossom, and then with the cow on the left-hand side and a calf on the right-hand side. And each one of these individual things is very consistent with sort of Egyptian notions, but I've never seen anything combined like this. And I really wonder, the ivory knob that's above there, I mean, it is just a knob, but it looks an awful lot like a sun disk, and Egyptians love that kind of visual punning, and I wonder if you don't have the sun disk up there with the sun god emerging from the lotus blossom. Could be my imagination, but it's a very cool little scene. And again, it seems to be not just imitating Egyptian ideas, but actually moving forward and developing their own theology around these kind of Egyptian myths. But inside the box was what we found that was incredibly interesting as well. So 3 faience vessels, and a couple of sets of iron tweezers and other cosmetic implements. But you can see here, very unusual. Here's the 2 sets of tweezers, one big and one small. So, I mean, dude wanted to look good when he stepped out. That's all I'm saying. He was plucking stuff and making sure. And then these little vessels, which are all fairly small, I mean, they're all about this big, would have been for holding perfumes and oils and that kind of thing. So dude was all perfumed and oiled up and all of that. He was looking good. And then this vessel here, I've never seen anything like it. It has no parallel that I know of. And if anybody recognizes it, let me know. But this seems to also have a very Nubian sensibility. So it's a kind of bead net pattern and as if suspended and hung, and that's a very Nubian kind of thing. But this is really the most extraordinary one. A little vessel with little statuettes of the god Bes, reflecting the Nubian obsession with Bes. They were really into Bes. But again, no parallel. The little frog lid is absolutely the cutest thing I've ever found. I mean, it's this cute little frog. It's like a centimeter big, but it's got little eyes and the webbed feet and a little crinkly skin. It's very cute. And you can see the colors are just vibrant. And this is without any special cleaning. This is just like normally cleaning them. Apparently the conditions inside the box were great for preservation. But the little frog lid actually has a parallel on Sardinia, of all places. So again, this guy has tapped into this larger a kind of elite style of the international style of the period. Maybe even some of the stuff is being generated in Nubia and being exported out. I don't know. Of course, the frog leg could have come from outside. But these 2 faience vessels have no good parallels within Egypt, so no reason to think they might not have been made in Nubia. Nubia had a thriving faience industry going all the way back before the Egyptian conquest in the Kerma culture. So it's quite possible that they were producing some of these items on their own. So I'll just conclude very quickly with this idea of entanglement and how it produced the foundation for this Nubian dynasty. So we see, again, not just the imitation, but the adaptation and the selective adaptation of Egyptian ideas and deities. So the god Bes, I've already talked about him a bit. He is monumentalized. He is pulled into the state pantheon in a way that you don't see in Egypt until much later, and that in fact may have been the result of Nubian influence flowing into Egypt during or after the Kushite period of the Kushite dynasty. So Bes becomes a central god, a very important deity, these monumental things. If you're going on that Nubia trip, this will be a treat. This is a very cool temple, the Temple to Mut at Jebel Barkal, but with these very unique Bes engaged columns. Another feature that we see where influence is flowing not from Egypt to Nubia, but the other way around, is in the ram imagery connected with the god Amun. And there's a very plausible case to make that, in fact, that imagery appears during the New Kingdom as a means of integrating the two cults, Nubian and Egyptian. And in fact, this is kind of an interesting thing. So on one level, with the god Bes, at some point, foreign gods become so familiar that, in fact, they no longer are foreign. So by the time that Bes statue was made, Bes may not have been seen as an Egyptian deity, but in fact was a Nubian god. And in a similar way, we see the joining of Amun and some local deity, maybe one with a very similar name. Later on, Amun in Nubia is called Amani, and you kind of wonder if there wasn't a god with a similar name and similar kind of creator connotations. But by fusing the two, then the Egyptians almost sealed the fate of their kingdom in the Third Intermediate period by providing that connection where the Kushite kings could come into Nubia, could come from Nubia into Egypt, claiming to be the legitimate successors of Egyptian pharaohs against the Libyan dynasts who had become decadent and had brought foreign influence into Egypt. And by this time, Amun was a Nubian god. And Amun as a ram was a Nubian as well as Egyptian. And so they could claim, no, we are the true ones who are favored by Amun, not these Libyans in the north. And so it's very interesting how you go from this process of colonization and domination to, in fact, Nubians reversing the story and coming to dominate Egypt through a very clever use of ideology and other techniques, but flowing from the colonial encounter, but how Egyptian culture was transformed in Nubian society. So I'll end with that. Thank you very much. Here's some acknowledgments, and especially Michel Bouzon and the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums.